Testing, 1, 2. All right, thanks so much for coming, everybody. Welcome to Trajectory Labs. My name is Mario Gibney. I'm your host for this evening. And yeah, just show of hands. Anyone here for the first time? No, we've all, oh, one over here. All right, thank you so much for joining us. If you need to use washrooms right outside the glass doors, you should be able to follow the instructions of our brand new sign if you need to get back in. And yeah, if you would like to ask questions during the presentation, we're going to be using Slido. So you can see there's some orange posters on the walls. So yeah, if you'd like to ask questions, just scan that QR code, submit the questions there. So most of them we're going to save at the end for the Q&A. But as a quick clarification, I may interrupt Wim, but we're doing that instead of the throw your hand up and interrupt during the presentation. So please use Slido. And without further ado, big welcome to Wim Howson Creutzberg, who's going to be presenting on war before and after transformative AI.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. That's great. It's a very lackluster applause. The goal is that after the presentation, the applause is way more enthusiastic. So we'll see. Well, exactly. Thank you for coming. I'm excited to be here with you. I want to talk. Oh, by the way, is there a clicker? Clicker? Yes. Great. No rush. Podium. Wow, you're so prepared. Thank you very much. Cool. It was on the podium. The original title of this talk is something like predicting shifts in the nature of AI security risks. That is still what we're talking about. I shifted a little bit, and hopefully it'll be worthwhile. I want to talk. It's possible that I don't know how to use clickers, or it's not working. The light is off. I don't know what's wrong with it. Yes. No. That's okay. We can proceed. The talk. Oh, great. Okay. Because what we're going to talk about is how a certain kind of security risk, I think, may shift and what it looks like, right? And I think when we talk about different kinds of risks, I think they're often very different and they're hard to categorize. And it's hard to have a kind of an intuitive taxonomy of how different risks relate to each other. For example, right, we'll do some audience engagement. Be engaged. When I say AI security risks, like big risks, right, things that could cause serious damage, right, kill lots of people. Can people raise hands as to what this might entail? We won't do this again, I promise. But please raise your hands. I want to see at least 3 hands. Yes, amazing. Thank you. Yes. Great. That's great. Yeah, and then we can imagine on the one hand, right? We could imagine bioweapons being made more accessible to crazy people who aren't as well resourced as states, right? And we can imagine other things. That's great. Are there more? Here, yes, please. Yeah, great. Loss of control, right? Yeah, yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. So loss of control. There's one thing. Okay, we can imagine nuclear deterrence being undermined. But okay, so we have all these risks. How do they all fit together? How should we make sense of them? Thank you. No worries. Um, I think this is a good question, and I want to focus. I want to focus on a particular kind of risk, and that is risk that has to do with states fighting each other. Right. We already know this is catastrophic. If you had a nuclear war, this would be very bad. Um, hey, it is. Thank you. Um, uh, and I want to give a kind of a rigorous account of how in political science people have often thought about what this looks like, why states engage in war, how this changes with AI. But before we get if we do a kind of transformative AI situation, and how it might change speculatively after. That's kind of what I'm going to go over, right? So I'm hopefully going to taxonomize some of these risks. Right? We're not going to talk about all of them, but we'll talk about those ones. We'll see how they change over time. And what I'm going to be talking about is what's called the rational choice account of war. And just as a disclaimer, these ideas are not mine. This part in particular owes to a post by IOPS researcher Oscar Delaney, which is excellent. It's called, Could AI Lead to War? And he is drawing on a paper from James Fearon, political scientist, who wrote an account of why we have war why we could have war between actors that are acting in their own self-interest, right? And of course, this isn't the only account, right? There are others. People talk about, you could have a constructivist account, but this is what we're going to be looking at, right? And okay, why is this an important question? Well, war is arguably not a good idea, right? Like most of the time, it's not good for the. It's very, very expensive. It's very risky. You're very weak afterwards. You're vulnerable, right? But it happens. Okay, why does this happen? They give basically two reasons, right? And in particular, why don't we just negotiate, right? So we could imagine, for instance, if Canada had an 80% chance of winning a war against Japan, then maybe, and they're negotiating over something very important. Maybe Japan gives Canada 80% of what Canada wants, right? We could imagine something like this, right? But this doesn't happen. Nonetheless, countries go to war, right? Or sometimes, right? And the two main reasons that they give for this are private information and commitment problems. And in particular, by private information, we mean that states have a lot of information about their own capabilities that their opponent doesn't have access to, right? But not only do they have that information, it's not that just they don't know it, but that both states are incentivized to mislead their adversary as to how much they have, right? So if, for instance, if Japan told Canada, oh, I have a very weak military, then other countries might be interested in coming and attacking them. And so they're going to bluff. They're both going to bluff. It's very hard to make credible claims, right? And on top of that, it can generally be hard to know exactly how strong a country's military is. So you have private information on the one hand, and then you have commitment problems, right? And commitment problems are, also a credibility issue, and it has to do with the fact that, like, for instance, if Canada were to invade Japan, right, or if we look at Russia and Ukraine right now, say before the war started, we thought that Russia, and this is another example from Delaney, Russia had an 80% chance of winning the war, right, against Ukraine. Ukraine could give them 80% of their land or whatever they wanted, and save a lot of lives. But of course, Russia could just invade again 10 years later, right? And there's nothing Ukraine can do about that. Okay, So these are the two issues, right? And okay, what this is kind of we're kind of trying to rationalize something that already happens, right? But bear with me. Okay, how does this change in the context of AI? I claim that AI by nature, by the nature of the technology, it is much on both of these accounts. It is much harder to avoid war. Like the problems of private information and commitment issues are much worse in the case of great power conflict over AI, or where AI is involved, right? So for instance, right, and this is I think often thought about in the context of a kind of rivalry between the U.S. and China, right? And we can think about how nuclear technology is kind of it's measurable, right? It's very easy to measure. We can count warheads. We can think about we have good metrics for thinking about how powerful different nuclear weapons are in a way that we don't for AI, right? Just inherently, right? And there's also a problem that because the technology is very complicated and it's kind of sprawling more than other technologies, and because it's evolving constantly and very quickly, and is evolving as kind of political tensions are rising. There's a lot more private information that there could be, and so there's a lot more to be uncertain about and information to bluff about, right? So that's that, right? And it's not that there isn't anything that can be done, but what happens in this situation typically is that states will try and figure out as much information as they can, and this is hard to do, right? And so we can see like this graph is from a paper about verification mechanisms, right? So for international treaties, right? And in that context, there are we can imagine that maybe they could send someone on site, right? I haven't included any examples from that. If we're just kind of looking from afar, what are things we can do? For instance, right, if we're looking at we could look at how much compute a country has, right? How big a data center is, and maybe try and get some information from that, and that's useful. But the states can hide that kind of information, right? The states can place a data center by a power plant in this example. They can hide their use of the financial transactions they might do. Those can be concealed. Other things that we might do to try and detect information about the hardware that our state is using can be concealed. We can put things underground, especially if you're China, right? We can build things fast. That's a joke, but it's useful, right? So this is hard in general, and that's on the hardware side, right? I think on the software side, Delaney thinks that this is actually the place where it's really hard, right? Like we can use satellites to look at data centers and stuff, and it's not clear to me that we always can, but we can't look at what algorithms are being run, what models are being served in those data centers, right? So we might think, oh, software is harder. I'm not sure that that's the case. I think that if we look at the kind of the cyber espionage landscape right now, I think it is very hard for states to defend their AI models against very capable actors, against even bad cyber attacks, let alone good cyber attacks, right? So very high effort investments, such as, right, this is from an example of a kind of cyber attack that a state might lead, that only the most cyber capable states could lead, right? And there's I think effectively no one, at least right now, and no one is currently on track to be able to in the next couple of years be able to defend against this kind of cyber attack, right? So if China develops a model, the U.S. can probably steal it, right? They can probably get a lot of information about it, and if they can't steal it, they can get a lot of information about it, right? And there are of course other kinds of espionage you can do, right? And this is a whole can of words. People can talk about air gapping, and so it's not clear how easy is this to do. We don't know. But it's hard, right? It's hard to have a lot of information about this in general, right? Like these states are really in the dark. Okay, and then there's commitment, right? So typically the way that commitment works, right? We've had this great piece where, as many may know, if a country does something that the international community thinks is horrific, we can embargo them, right? And then over time, they don't benefit from compounding economic growth, and their military and economy is dramatically weakened over the course of years or decades, right? Um, and that is actually a strong reason that states have not to break commitments, right? There can be retribution if someone breaks their commitment. And then on the other hand, right, that's a very slow one. On the other hand, we have a very fast one, which is nuclear war, right? If you break commitment, at the worst, we can nuke you and everyone dies. But that I think that too changes in the case of AI, and I think in this case, it's useful to think about the way people think about it often is in terms of the possibility of a decisive strategic advantage enabled by AI. And so what's meant by that? Well, the general thinking is technology can enable large jumps in military capacity. Here's an example from situational awareness, a real-world example, right, of how during the Gulf War, the U.S. had a 20 to 30 year military lead. They had much less stuff, right? The Iraqis had invested many resources. They had a lot of time, and yet the U.S. completely obliterated them. There were fewer deaths on the U.S. side, like dramatically fewer, right? 292 compared to 20,000, 50,000 Iraqi dead. So they just got obliterated, right? And the claim is that it's that the U.S. had better tech. Okay, that makes sense. And so the thinking, typically, the way this thinking goes is that AI could automate R&D, across science in general. And maybe there are other ways we get a decisive strategic advantage, right? But typically, the way people think about it is that maybe the U.S. has a bunch of AI scientists dramatically accelerating their understanding of science across the board. They get a bunch of new technologies, and maybe you get a century and a decade worth of progress, right? Maybe you have the equivalent of China in 1915 fighting the U.S. in 2025, right? And okay, what does this mean? It means that other countries will be reluctant to allow any country to reach that level of capability, right? Because if they can undermine deterrence, then the leverage that the rest of the world has for upholding commitments is gone. And again, like I know this is information that is familiar to people. Some people may have heard it a million times. It wouldn't be in here if you were the only ones in the room, I promise. But the goal here is to understand that this is a commitment problem, right? This is a problem of undermining deterrence undermines our ability to keep commitments. Now, I think that you might not there are some caveats in order, right? We might not get a decisive strategic advantage. I think that for instance, we might not get a kind of dramatic automation of R&D. This whole thing could happen very slowly. It could also not undermine the nuclear deterrent, right? And by the way, I'm going quickly over this, but hopefully you have questions, right? Like, why wouldn't it undermine the nuclear deterrent? Is one question you might ask. And we could go into that. One example could be that, and this is also by coincidence from a paper from the same guy who wrote the original rationalist explanations of war paper, where he talks about how, for instance, right, we could imagine some countries who are afraid that they'll lose secondary deterrence, pre-planting nukes in a country the way, like using drug cartels or something, right? Like, we can't secure borders with drug cartels, maybe you could have people hand-deliver nukes into a country or something, right? Then we can deploy them, so you don't need missile defense systems, right? The point being that it's very, very hard in general, if it's impossible to have a kind of iron dome against nuclear defense. And so, like, maybe we just don't do it, even if you have even if you have ASI, right? Artificial superintelligence transforming intelligence, whatever you want to call it. But the point again, though, is that it doesn't need to happen. That what needs to happen is that people are aware that it's a possibility. If a country thinks that a country might reach this, right? Whether or not they do, they could launch a preemptive attack. Okay. How could this change? Good question. This is relatively brief, but I think first we could imagine that private information problems change a lot and are a much less significant driver of instability. And there are two parts of this, right? One, I think, is automated negotiation tools. We can imagine AI tools that could do, well, two things, right? One is relieve bandwidth issues, but I think crucially, right, they could, this is from a paper from Forethought, they could permit the confidential transfer of private information, right? So if we can imagine that people are negotiating, right, these automated negotiations, the AI systems that kind of know what their opponents, what the adversaries' AI systems know and don't know, and they know what their positions and preferences are with respect to some situation. They can decide what to convey, and that can be conveyed without it spreading to other people, right? And I think crucially here, why is this important? The private information issue is about bluffing, right? The problem is that if people know what my actual abilities are, it means that when I'm negotiating for a non-violent result, I'll have less leverage, and that I'm vulnerable to others who might come and attack me later. It's because information spreads like that, right? Once you release it, you can't unrelease it. And we can imagine that maybe we could have negotiating tools that would solve that problem, right? And so if you could solve this problem of having kind of like single use, discard, burn after reading features built into automated negotiation tools, we wouldn't have this problem. And that could be good. And I think on the second thing has to do with bandwidth. This is a quote from Carl Schulman about what he thinks will be one of the most central aspects of the way that the government works and how kind of society is organized after you have transformative AI, which is that everyone can have a personal AI advisor, right? I think it's worth reading this in full. And this is an example from COVID, right? So, okay, if we had dealt with COVID at the time where people had AI advisors, right? Decision makers could have pointed out all the places where the system is making the top level objective of getting a vaccine quickly, where that's going wrong, and clarifies what changes will make it happen quicker. If you replace person X with person Y, if you cancel this regulation, these outcomes will happen, and you'll get the vaccine earlier. People's lives will be saved, the economy will be rebooted, etc. I think in this situation, we're imagining that the AI systems are able to just process a lot of information very, very quickly, and they know exactly what your objectives are, right? And they can just inform that very well. And so maybe there's some additional insight there, but I think essentially part of the problem here is that there's like a ton. We can imagine a lot of things that are different post transformative AI, right? But and like the bandwidth issues facing decision makers, is this the biggest problem? Like maybe not, right? Plausibly no, right? Like very likely no. But it is the reason why we have on this account war today, right? And why we have it. It's like a very, very deep problem. And the nature of that problem might be different. It might still happen, but it might happen for very different reasons, right? And I think indeed it probably would, right? If everyone has AI advisors, you don't have this bandwidth issue, which has been exceptionally challenging in the case of dealing with AI stuff, right? So overall, I think that the nature of the reasons why we are dealing with issues of international stability, right, that encompass everything from nuclear deterrence to like proxy wars are exceptionally bad as we are dealing with AI, and I think that they could be these specific reasons could be resolved if we were able to get transformative. That said, right, this may not be the hardest part of dealing with transformative AI or to having transformative AI, right? Like we could all die, for starters. There could be other concerns that are just much bigger concerns, right? But if we were to have problems like this, the nature of the reasons why we had these problems would be very different, and we might solve them. So that is the gist of my provocation to you. I'd be curious to know what people think. I haven't talked here about commitment technologies. There are proposals for that. People have talked about ways that we could have more, fancier negotiations to solve collective action problems, right? Or more binding agreements, right? I think, and yeah, I haven't gone into that here, but there is some work on that out there if you're interested. I think in many cases those go both ways, right? So it doesn't mean that overall you have less conflict. But yeah, the TLDR on that is that it changes the nature of the conflict, or maybe it makes it easier for small actors to launch coups and so forth. Right? But overall, I think that we could expect that great power conflict, which has not been an issue for a long time, could genuinely be a very big issue. I think the people who have investigated this, the post that I'm drawing on, think that the risk of just nuclear war, straight out war, because of the possibility of transformative AI is actually quite high, concerningly high, right? But this may be, if we can get through this may be an issue with an expiration date, and like we could solve this problem, which is pretty exciting. I know there weren't any pictures in the presentation, but hopefully you are still with me. I think that a lot of these ideas are actually pretty radical, and so I'm curious to hear what you think. Yeah, that's all. Thank you very much.
We're going to do Q&A in about 3 minutes, so feel free to have a quick bathroom break or ask or vote on any questions. All right, let's dig into it. Thanks so much for the talk, Wim. How you feeling?
A shame. We can go back and forth.
We're just gonna go back and forth. I think. Yeah, let's do that. All right. So a lot of the a lot of the talks seem to be based on okay, here there are this kind of like rationalist view of why war happens. And so maybe this question is a little outside the scope, but like, have you done much thinking about the kind of more irrational reasons for war and the degree to which AI may or may not impact that?
That's a great question. So, yeah, I haven't done the work, but I've done some thinking about how I think other people should do a lot of thinking about it, or do more thinking about it. Yeah, well, me too. I thought about, in other words, I thought about how I think they're underrated, right? So I think a lot of what I'm doing here is presenting work on how people are thinking about these problems, right? I think this is a thing that people are thinking a lot about, and I think that people should know about it, right? There hasn't been much work done on other approaches in international relations to thinking about things about AI, or there's been, I think, relatively little, and so it's not there. But I think more people should do it, right? And I think in particular, right? So this approach is supposed to be kind of a very generalizable theory, right? We're looking at, okay, we have a bunch of principles about how an actor would act in this situation, and then we can extrapolate a lot from that. But I think that if we look at, especially if we look in the short term, the people who are making these decisions are very specific people, right? In California, there's like a small handful of people, right? Tens, maybe dozens of people who are making specific decisions, and they're very specific, and they have specific traits, right? And so I think there's some interesting work to be done there, and I think like the Trump administration is very eccentric in their approach to decision making, right? And like probably doesn't fit this model very well, arguably, right? Maybe they don't. And I think it would be cool to see more kind of more work based on the specifics of the situation that we're in right now, right? I will add also that another approach that's very common in this space is the constructivist approach, right? Which is looking at how ideas influence the outcomes of things, right? So it doesn't even and not looking at whether these ideas are true or not, right? Whether they actually reflect reality, but just looking at, do people believe them, right? And if everyone believes something's going to happen, if something's inevitable, right, or it's impossible, how does that affect things? I think those are very important questions, and I would be good to see more work on it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I think I did hit you with a question that was a little maybe outside the scope. But what about this? Yeah. So one of the it seems like the main lens through which you viewing conflict here was interstate conflict. Is that right? Yeah. To what degree does this stuff apply to kind of coups or civil wars and stuff like that? I would imagine that there must be like a considerable amount of overlap because, like, surely kind of if you can, predict the outcome, you can negotiate it, exchange it, advance. Like certain high-level concepts like that obviously apply to both. But do you have like a kind of a clear idea of where you would draw the border there? If it would be really helpful if you had a kind of example of some way that this would impact interstate conflicts, but might not as much, coups or civil wars.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I can imagine this kind of work becoming more relevant to questions about coups, insofar as AI and advanced AI could make coups more doable. I think there's been a decent amount of work done on how, political takeovers could just become much more feasible if people have access to advanced AI. And so I can imagine in that situation it looks more like a war. I feel that the starting conditions are otherwise quite different. Like, the starting question is, okay, why does this happen? Like, if why don't you have it seems kind of funny to ask, why don't you have a negotiation between the people who are cooing and the current government about the expected value of the coup? You know what I mean? Like, it's different. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I guess like a lot of the kind of negotiation side of things and like the what was it you said the confidential processing of private information, like a lot of that assumes that there's two very clearly distinct entities that recognize each other. And I imagine that like if there's like a civil war or some coup type situation, like it might be hard to keep track of like who are all the relevant actors in play. And on the other hand, like one side of the conflict might not even want to, offer legitimacy to the other side to recognize them. So yeah, those seem like examples where it doesn't apply. Right. Cool. Yeah, what do you see? What do you see the role of state to mitigating this? To the degree, like, can you talk a bit more about like state versus private actors? Um, who asked this question, by the way? Feel free to elaborate. Okay, I think I can paraphrase. Yeah, I think there's some overlap with the kind of Civil War coup question as well. Just that Nick was asking the degree to which this things change because AI has a lot more of overlap with the private sector, whereas like some of the analogies we use has to do with nuclear war, and that was very much like a private actor, or sorry, state actors against each other. Like I'm not aware of any private entity that has ever become nuclear armed. Whereas it's very much not the case with AI. Yeah, how do you see that impacting this type of work?
It's a good question. These are all very good questions. And well, no, it's I think that yeah. I mean, I am focused on like great power conflict and state versus state conflict more broadly here, just because otherwise will take too long. I and I don't think I have anything great to say. I think like that'll probably be much more relevant. I think that like the chance of a company being a major political actor, I think is a real possibility in a way that it used to not be. Yeah, and I'll say, just pausing on that on the question of the coup, I can imagine that part of the other problem at a first pass is that a lot that the starting positions are just different, right? Where in that the element of surprise probably matters a lot more in a coup. Like you don't want to if you're like, oh, I'm gonna kill you, and it's like, let me assess what your capabilities are. Like it's not gonna work like that, right? So I think it's just an inherently different situation and requires a different kind of analysis. Yeah, and I think that's a good question, but I don't think I have an answer for it.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind is also I imagine that if like you did have a private entity that like had its own armed forces and were able to do things like invade other countries, take over things. At that point, I'm not even sure if it makes sense to reason about them as a private entity. I'm thinking of just like the East India Company and like them having their own like armed forces and stuff. And at that point, like you may as well treat them like a state. But yeah. Okay, so you made a lot of comments about the ways in which transformative AI might change kind of the nature of warfare and the likelihood of them being it breaking out. Did you land anywhere in terms of like feeling more or less reassured? Like, I mean, war more likely, less likely, per your post? Put some numbers on it for us.
I think I won't. Yeah.
I'm going to change the question slightly. Going into this research, I'm curious if you were thought war become more or less likely after transformative AI, and then did your intuition around that shift at all after doing this research?
It's a good question, and I think it highlights something that could be misleading, right? Which is that I in my I think intuitive sense of this is that like it's really hard to know what's going to happen after AGI, but whatever we want to define that as. But the hardest period is before, right? And if you can kind of get things to be relatively stable, we'll be fine. And so I had this intuition, but I didn't have a sense of exactly what the reasons why we can imagine things being more stable after you have transformative AI were. So I don't I feel I'd heard a lot of people saying that war is actually a big deal and a bigger deal than they thought, and I believed them. And now I feel like that's actually grounded. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, I think I would probably say that in general, I don't think that like AI-driven great power conflict, like serious great power conflict, is something people think enough about, and I think that it's probably a bigger deal than many would think it is. Yeah.
All right, so war and underrated risk. Yeah, I guess that's good if you're just expecting a singleton takeover. Then maybe great power conflict is a step in the right direction, but maybe bad if you're expecting the utopia to hit within 10 years. Yeah.
That's another part of it, right? It's like if a state would be willing to launch a preemptive first strike, like they obviously don't think that's necessarily the worst outcome for them, right? And so, like it's not. You can imagine some of these more extreme cases in which war isn't the worst outcome, but it depends on what you think.
Yeah, I still don't know if you became more or less reassured, but that's fine. You don't have to give a super simple answer. Okay, one of the things you talked about was takeoff speeds and how this affects things. If we see kind of industrial revolution in a can in some lab somewhere, then boom, everything's ahead. Or if there's more kind of like several different actors competing over the course of like a decade or two. Can you give us a more concrete sense of like how you see things playing out differently in those two scenarios? Because it's pretty easy to agree that that seems relevant, but like specifically in what way for this topic?
That's a great question. Yeah, they are. This is the worst question of the bunch. I think that the crucial thing here is that in that situation, it is harder for having better AI capabilities than your adversary to translate into having a decisive strategic advantage. Because having a decisive strategic advantage is something that comes from, like, if we think, for instance, right, about like there's a graph that I had earlier that I liked a lot up there, right, which was kind of showing what the highest level of cyber attack looks like, right? And this costs $1 billion. It can take years to prepare. It can have thousands of people involved, or on the order of 1,000 people involved. But I think crucially, right, it's actually not that much money, like compared to the cost of a war for China, right? Like $1 billion isn't that much money, and so if you can, basically, if they can steal model weights, right, and it's just a matter of time, then the amount of time, then what matters is the way that you get a strategic advantage is by having something your opponent doesn't, right? And what happens is that in the longer timeline scenarios, it's easier for diffusion to happen faster between states than within states. If the U.S. develops something, but then, and China gets it afterwards, if China can integrate it into their economy and military faster, or maybe they can catch up, right? And so you don't get the advantage, even though you have the acceleration capability.
Yeah, and then one final question. So you've talked about how this has impacted warfare, but specifically in the likelihood of these wars breaking out. In a more broad, geopolitical strategic sense, how do you expect this to impact? So, one thing, if wars become a lot less likely, because we have super fast bandwidth in terms of processing and negotiation, and kind of you're able to process private information without relieving it. Great. Do you have any thoughts on how that would affect geopolitical strategy outside of that?
No. Well, sure, right? Yes, but it's but I'm trying here, and I've tried here, right? And maybe you're bemoaning the lack of graphics in the presentation, but I've tried to keep things very grounded in what people know and what people have studied for a long time, and I find it it's there are a lot of things that you could say, right? It's a very fun conversation. Maybe off mic, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair, and I guess also it's very, very tough to read about things because if we have transformative AI, presumably there's going to be so many things are going to be different that it becomes difficult to reason. So I can respect your desire to kind of stay focused on like certain principles, at least for today's talk. Yeah, thanks so much, Wim. Big round of applause.
Thank you. If you found any of those answers unsatisfying, let's talk about it. Yeah.
Wim will be around for a bit. Everyone's welcome to stick around for a while longer. Thanks for coming.